Legitimate grievances against police brutality tipped into excuse-making for criminal behavior. Racial politics could cut both ways, as the transformative message of unity and brotherhood was drowned out by the language of recrimination. And what had once been a call for equality of opportunity, the chance for all Americans to work hard and get ahead, was too often framed as a mere desire for government support, as if we had no agency in our own liberation, as if poverty was an excuse for not raising your child, and the bigotry of others was reason to give up on your son. All of that history is how progress stalled. That's how hope was diverted. That's how our country remained divided.
All right, folks. President Obama speaking yesterday, 50 years after Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. Joining us now is a man who I told him we'd invite him back after the speech. And we have done just that. Richard Epstein, senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, joins us once again. Hello, Richard. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, thank you. I'm still recovering from the president's speech.
Well, I'm sure you are. We many of us are, but I miss you in the studio, I must say. But the phone is doing very nicely. So, your impressions. I know you wrote a piece about the whole history of 50 years ago and where we are today, et cetera. But your impressions of what the president had to say.
Well, I mean, the speech is basically divided into two halves. The first tries to replicate and does a reasonably good job of capturing the heroic moments back in 1963, where it was very easy to tell good from bad by virtue of the fact that who held all the whip hand on all the key cards and all who did not. But as ever, when you start to try and transform that political environment to the modern days, it just doesn't work. One of the difficulties that the civil rights movement has is how to reinvent itself after its own successes in getting rid of barriers. And the central point to remember here is that the kinds of propositions that he puts forward now are much more dubious and controversial. He seems to think that there's a program, strong minimum wage, various kinds of government interventions and guarantees that really are necessary to make good on that earlier promise. Somebody like myself, who comes from a more classical liberal tradition, says the minimum wage may be wonderful for those people who can earn above it, but in fact it's a complete disaster for those individuals whom it shuts out of work. So if you actually look at labor markets today, we're ripe with protections, and yet the levels of black teenage unemployment are higher today than they were at the time when Martin Luther King spoke, and indeed higher than they were in 1954 at the height of segregation. And so the battle is to figure out why that happens, and it turns out that when you restrict the opportunity of workers to get cheap jobs, which have very bad pay, what you do is you also restrict their opportunities to learn on the job, to gain advancement, to get work skills, to make the kinds of contacts which will allow them to advance. And so what happens is there's nothing whatsoever about the cause of liberation, that is, getting rid of barriers of entry of one kind or another, which translates into having these various regulatory programs. And the president is so committed to his own policies that what he does is he somehow or other thinks that when successful people become more successful, that necessarily drives down everybody else. What he has to do is to try to figure out how to grow the pie, and you can't grow a pie by having a divisive speech which again attacks the top 1% for being successful, as if their failure will somehow or other improve the lot of everybody else.
Right, and it's why I played that particular soundbite, which ends with that. That's why we're still divided. Or why we remain divided, yet, many people, and you just alluded to it, talk about him as a great divider. He was elected back in 2008 as a great uniter on all fronts. There's no blue, there's no red, there's purple, post-racial presidency, if white America could elect a black man. But he himself has done nothing economically, racially, I believe. He's taken every opportunity he can to make villains. The white cops in the case in Cambridge were acted stupidly. The Trayvon Martin case he weighed in on even before anything was adjudicated there, and right on down the list. And of course, as you said, the more successful someone becomes, the more evil they are, and the more responsible they are for making everybody else do worse. Except, of course, Hollywood and athletes because they're his buddies.
Yes, look, I mean, let me just tell you a story. I'm a shareholder in a company, and this is a company called Ivy Bridge, which was designed to figure out how it could extend online education to all sorts of people who are below the median in economic circumstances. So they form an alliance with a university called Tiffin University. They get themselves a rating from the Gates Foundation, which puts them #1. And within a week, they get a letter from the Higher Education Council for the Midwest announcing that their accreditation has been pulled for a series of regularities that nobody could understand. So they have to shut down the school on short order. And then within a week or two after that, they get a notice from the Department of Justice that they're under investigation through the Civil Division to see whether or not they've engaged in wrong practices. Well, what happens when you start doing those things is you drive capital away. You disrupt the lives of 3,000 students who now have to clamor to get some other kind of education. And you still don't even know, because nobody gives you a hearing, nobody gives you notice, nobody tells you what the actual charges are, nobody gives you a chance to cure them, as to what it is that you did wrong. And so this is what constantly happens in this sector, is you have these high-minded pronouncements about how it is we'd love to improve the general level of education, and then you get these actions done at the mid-level, which essentially kill successful opportunities. Remember, most of these programs that get shut down by the Department of Education and so forth are programs which have very high levels of consumer satisfaction and very high levels of sort of industry approval and so forth. And so what you see here is an administration which is so opposed, for example, to the profit motive generally, that in one area where it's absolutely critical to get something better than monopoly schools and community colleges, what you do is you see them actively taking away the accreditation programs that are otherwise available. So, I mean, this happens all the time with respect to this system. So the president has to look at the level of performance in the United States. And these mid-level actions, these higher levels of regulation, have retarded the level of growth and have shut down the level of opportunity that are open to other people. And it turns out he's just somebody you cannot approach. The level of dogmatism on the means to ends question is complete. He gives the same speech now that he gave 5 years ago in the face of policies which I think have had a pretty dismal rate with respect to growth, unemployment, educational improvement.
Well, that's
and
what
the like.
That's what, not to interrupt, but I want to pick up on that. We're talking to Richard Epstein, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, here on the Steve Malzberg Show. He's been president for 5 years. And all the negatives that he cited that still exist, and all the problems that he cited that still exist, and many of those have been exacerbated by, I mean, you know, they've been made much worse. Black unemployment among teens now is over 40%. It wasn't that under George Bush. But that aside, he didn't take blame for any of these things. He didn't say what he was going to do to fix them, what he's been doing to fix them. I think that was lacking from the speech as well.
Well, it's lacking. He does have an agenda, which is to double down on failure. I mean, he opposes individuals who believe that high taxes and extensive regulations have accounted for some of our failures. He thinks that a higher minimum wage law will keep the same levels of employment and just transfer the dollars. You know, he's behind living wage kinds of movements and so forth. And every time he starts talking about markets, the next word out of his mouth is the word greed. And of course, you know, markets don't work by greed. Greedy people don't get trading partners. Markets operate because there are individuals out there who provide others a service that they value more than the cash that they have to acquire it. And so if you think of all these transactions as exploitation, you want to suppress them. If you think of them as mutual gain, you want to make sure that they don't become oppressive in an individual case by sneaking behavior, fraud, misrepresentation, and so forth.
Right.
But he has such a powerful prior conception that what it does is it kills innovation, drives foreign entrepreneurs away from our shores, shrinks our productive base, and leaves us in a situation where essentially we are poorer now by a very substantial amount than we would have been if he had had more open market policies for the last 5 years.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's nothing about the Martin Luther King take down the barriers to vote, which drives you to extensive progressive programs with respect to labor, with respect to capital taxation, and so forth. Market liberalization is the next logical step to follow, and he refuses to follow it.
Now, why? Now I'm going to ask you to go in and give your opinion, if you're willing to. I mean, do you believe he's to the left of a socialist? Do you believe that his utopia is everybody? You know, I was having this conversation with someone earlier today that you know, he would like to see the McDonald's employees get $50,000 a year and the computer programmer get $50,000 a year and live next door to each other in the same exact homes, driving the same exact cars, and that would be his vision of fairness and utopia.
Well, you can't have equal pay for unequal work, which is what he demands. What will happen is people who do productive work will slack off, and the others who are guaranteed will slack off as well, so that you get everybody in a worse position. Look, he was with me at the University of Chicago for many years, and one of the things that was so striking about it is it was impossible to read him in a private conversation. He was one of these people who would always kind of listen, nod his head respectfully, and then when you were done, you could never quite tell what he was
You're
thinking.
talking about President Obama.
I'm talking about President Obama.
Okay.
I mean, you know, we worked at the same institution for a fair number of years. He's obviously not influenced by people like myself. I mean, that was very clear from the beginning. And, you know, people say, well, it's folks like Saul Alinsky, neighborhood organizer, that did influence his behavior. This is probably true. I would have something in a slightly different way of saying it. He's never worked in a for-profit organization, so he's never been able to see how people form missions and visions, work endlessly in order to get them across, understand the importance of keeping their employees satisfied, their customers satisfied. So having never gone through that particular process, he sort of thinks that the way in which people become rich is by making other people poor. In fact, the way you become rich in this work is by making other people rich. I mean, if you're trying to figure out, for example, how much wealth a man like Bill Gates had to create in order to earn $50 billion for himself, the answer is probably in other people. He had to create $500 billion in order to do the same thing.
Right.
That just is not part of his mental map.
No, and let me give you one more, Richard, as we close here, and not to interrupt because I could listen to you go on all day. But the fact of the matter is, it was a few weeks ago when he was talking about the American dream, and it was some speech, and he said, you know, it used to be, you know, the American dream was, you know, you wanted a decent education and a decent job and a roof over your head. And I came on the air after that, and I said, wait a minute. The American dream, at least, has always been, as far as I've known it, to reach for the stars, to go out there, to be a millionaire, a billionaire, to have a big house and many cars and a great job and become rich, not to get by.
No, I mean, but somehow or other he thinks that kind of the lack of distinction, the stability and basic norms is enough. It's kind of as though his American dream has a ceiling as well as a floor. You know, my view is, again, it's exactly the opposite. If you want to be abundant and optimistic, you hope that people who work hard will, in fact, be more successful than those who don't. It will, in fact, increase overall wealth, increase opportunities for others who do business for them, and it will be a reminder to those who slack off that there's a price that you pay for your own activity.
Absolutely.
And then when you have rich people, what they do is they turn around and they understand the good fortune they've had, and they form Stanford University, and they form the Sloan Kettering Commission. They become highly active in various kinds of charitable activities. So the money gets recirculated in any event.
Yep.
So instead of constantly trying to clamp down on the top, you want to create as many people in those
At the
ranks
top
as
as possible. Absolutely.
Yeah, and my friend, Reverend Ike, said the last thing that you can do for the poor is what you want to do for the poor is not be one of them. And if that were followed by everybody, we'd solve the problem. But it is, in fact, the kind of morose tone, shuttered mills, as a constant sort of imitation pessimism that underlies him, which is, I think, defeatist in the way in which it transmits the message to all
I could not agree with you more, sir. Richard, a pleasure to speak to you again, sir. We'll do it again soon. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Richard Epstein, ladies and gentlemen, senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. I got to tell you,